unsure conversation that's going around where we need to offer some more clarity. We need to get some points across, and we need to kind of tease some things out a little bit so that folks can have a better understanding of these terms that we're using. And then therefore we believe that if we had a better understanding of how to use these terms, we would be in a better position to move forward in a more succinct direction, if you will, in terms of how we then can apply solidarity in our own lives, but also hopefully seeing the connection between joining an organization that's working for justice and practicing solidarity. And so we first want to highlight for you all, a lot of times people are under the impression that when you show solidarity for someone, it means you are taking away what makes your position and your struggle. You're taking away the integrity of that because you're instead trying to show up for someone else and to build up their integrity. And I guess people think that when you show solidarity, that's what you're doing, even if you yourself are not getting the respect from the same person that you're showing up for. And I think that we should really unpack that a little bit, because that's not what solidarity means. Those are two different concepts. When we think about solidarity, it is something that we all need to understand more of. And that's partly why we're doing today's seminar. But I think it's another way to look at it is thinking about all the systems of oppression that are currently operating the system that we live in, right? So we're thinking about capitalism and how that is a system that does not value people, especially poor people. We're thinking about colonialism. We're thinking about white supremacy. We're thinking about patriarchy. We're thinking about homophobia. All of these systems, and they are systems, you all. These are not people who are practicing these actions. That's part of a system, but these are literal systems that every single one of us is born into. And we then have to figure out how we can resist and push against it and organize against it every single day until the time comes where we can find a way to gain control and to change how these systems determine societal reform as well as societal functioning. And when I say we can get a way to control, what I'm usually referring to is that we know that land equals power. Having land ownership means that you are in a position to make different decisions. African descent people, African people are not in ownership of our lands. If we were, we wouldn't be disrespected the way we would be. There wouldn't be as many police brutality issues as there are. African femme people and African women would not be dying while they're trying to give birth to their babies if we were in control of our land. You know why? Because we would be in a better position to communicate with other institutions that have already figured out how to eradicate those kind of issues, like Cuba, for example, and we would be able to protect African people because African people would be needed, and everybody in the world would understand that African people are needed. You need from Africa, so why wouldn't you need them from Africa? You would treat people differently who descend from Africa because you're relying on them. You're depending on them. Without them, you can't create the Teslas and the laptop and the cell phones that you're currently relying on to profit off of and to sell for resources. Every single one of those resources comes from a country in Africa. You wouldn't be able to sell the cars, partly because you wouldn't be able to build the parts, but also because you wouldn't even have tires because rubber trees grow in Africa. So the point we are trying to make today, you all, is that when you have land ownership, you are in a better position to determine how the rest of the world treats you. And unfortunately, we see so many examples of colonized people who are not in control of their land. That's literally what colonization is defined as, right? And so because of that, you don't just see this disrespect happening to African people, we see it happening, as Comrade Ajamu just said, to indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. We see it happening to Palestinian people. We see it happening to Asian descent people and different specific parts of Asia, right? When it really breaks down. But just as a whole, we're seeing that taking place. And then I also want to acknowledge even poor European, poor white people. We see this happening with them. We also see a form of colonization happening even with our Irish descent folks, right? Because we know Britain has been colonizing them perhaps for the longest time throughout this time on earth of over 1,000 years. So we're saying all of this to say when we express solidarity, of course, we're going to talk more about that tonight, but we're thinking about everything being redefined. And I want to stress that because a lot of the terms that we understand, a lot of the terms that we exist with in this world, how we have made meaning of them, how we've understood them, how we apply them in our everyday lives, you have got to understand, excuse me, that they are rooted in colonial white supremacy, patriarchal, heteronormative ways. You have got to understand that. You have got to understand that. And when I say that, I mean you have got to accept it and you have got to understand it. It is a very big pill that you must swallow. You must, you must, you must. Because if you really think about it, where did you learn where solidarity came from? Who taught that to you? It was literally informed by some European, probably a man somewhere, who just decided, oh, this is what this can mean. And now the rest of the world has now adopted it because we're not even taught to think for ourselves, for crying out loud, because everything we do is framed and positioned the way white supremacy can benefit and the way colonial imperial power and capitalistic power can benefit. So we don't even have the ability to literally create our own words. We don't have the ability to create our own languages. We had that and it was taken from us. And some of us are so ignorant, we don't understand that that's what happened with colonization. My dad just mentioned Waka Flocka. That's a great example of that, right? So if we understand that solidarity was probably not defined in a humanistic way to begin with, then we have an opportunity to kind of redefine that. I would challenge you all to think about all the terms that you use on a day-to-day basis. Me personally, I try really hard to be aware of terms that are gender exclusive. So I find myself not using the word human. I find myself not using the word man made. I find myself not using the word hype man because I've realized that a lot of the words we used are very much gender centric and they are very much male centric. And I personally don't feel included when people use the word you guys when they speak to me like that. And I'll usually tell them I don't identify as a guy. So can you find another way to reroute that? You could say, hey, you people, hey, fam, what's up, comrade? I mean, there's several different terms that you can use nowadays. There's no reason that we have to limit ourselves, but it's going to require a little thinking. It's going to require a little critical consciousness. It's going to require some political education enhancing, right? And that's going to require the brain to go, which is a little scary for some of us. However, it's necessary. It is necessary, necessary, necessary. So yes, we're going to continue to talk about solidarity, but I would encourage us to think about redefining it from a more humane standpoint. Just think about that for a second. And while we think about that, we should also think about how, when we define what it means to sacrifice, again, that is not a term that we have been able to clearly stand in support of what that word really means, which means we should be able to redefine that based on our principles, based on our ideologies, based on, excuse me, how we want to live in a world that is truly rooted and centered with people first. People's needs are being met first. People's wants are being met first. No amount of money is ever going to be more important than the humanity of people. But yet, this is not the world we currently live in. So we can redefine what these words look like, because when we think about sacrifice, and that's another word that we definitely want to see more action of, especially, I would argue, in the face of capitalism, because capitalism has taught us that we can be selfish and we should be individualistic as much as possible. But we know when a person is sacrificing, if we're thinking of the humane part of that, we're thinking of the fact that that means you are devoiding all of your own personal desires, your personal connections, because you are now literally putting all of that to the side so that you can focus on doing what you need to do so that someone else can benefit from your sacrifice in some way, shape, or form, so that someone else can benefit from you trying to assist them, which means you're not centering your own needs in the process of doing that. And I think that, redefining these words from a humanistic standpoint is going to be key. I also think it's important for us to think about how when you join an organization that's working for justice, that teaches you how these terms can be used. You get to start to get really familiar with what sacrifice means, especially because if you're organizing, you are engaging in the work. You're meeting people every day who are struggling, and it's reminding you of why this work is so important. You're in a position where you start to really understand what would happen if this work was not as relevant. How would your life be different if you weren't organizing? And a lot of times it can be, it can be burdening. It can be exhausting. It can be taxing. It can be expensive to organize. Absolutely. But I would argue, what's the opposite though? Being oppressed? Because being oppressed is a burden too. Being oppressed is taxing and exhausting too. Being dehumanized every single day is not something that I look forward to when I wake up in the morning. I'm thankful to wake up, but at the same time, as these interactions take place, I usually take a deep breath before I engage in responding because I'm thinking to myself, and here we go. And now I got to deal with this. You know what I mean? And so I think it's important that we really think about what's the connection between being in an organization and how that could, in theory, give you the strength that could give you a safe space to talk about these interactions. And it could also give you an opportunity to learn and to grow so that you can learn from the ancestors on ways that they have dealt with those same interactions. This is why we say that you should join an organization that's working for justice, because you want to increase your political education. And we also want to stress to you that the photos that you're going to see on these slides, we're going to be highlighting folks that have literally been displaying since time can tell what different acts of solidarity looks like, but also that they are in affiliated organizations. And because of the work that they are doing in those orgs, that has allowed their work to cross and intersect. There could be an opportunity where Yasser Arafat had an opportunity to meet Thomas Sankara. Maybe. But I would strongly argue that the work that Yasser was doing by being a co-founder of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, shout out to PLO, and then the work that our comrade Thomas Sankara was doing in Burkina Faso, as well as in other parts of Africa, doing the different organizing, but also really trying to make a difference on the ground with community social revolution changes that he was working on. I would argue those two organizations and the work that they both were doing to build community development, that is the reason that their paths crossed. That is the reason that they saw a reason to be in solidarity. There was a reason that they both wanted to support the other person because, well, the other organization, because of the work that that org was doing. And so just thinking more about that, we can think about how solidarity is really with the two parties or two entities or two organizations really developing and forming what we would say is kind of a mutual relationship where there's some type of basic understanding and there is mutual respect, I would argue, that's been equitably distributed throughout those two things. This mutual relationship can be based on principles that both entities have developed, maybe an understanding that they both have come to. And then as I say this and we move to the next slide, even with understanding how those two entities have come into understanding what the case can be, there is still so much respect to the craft. There's so much dedication to the work that organization is doing because both parties would understand this is bigger than themselves. We say this every weekend, so I know you're tired of hearing it, but it bears repeating, you all. When you live under capitalism, you are formed and shaped and guided to be the selfish person in the whole face of the land. You are encouraged. You are celebrated when you are individualistically putting your needs first, because that is the norm in this world. So when you're in an organization that's working for justice, your brain starts to be reshaped. Your brain starts to be reformed, and you start to understand, oh, shoot, this is bigger than me. And hopefully there's some humility attached to that because it never should have been just about you. But maybe you needed a space to grow and to understand that. Okay, we'll take that. But once you start to really dig into that work and you start to see there's all of these different connections, you like Marcus Garvey says, he traveled all around the world and he saw that African people were struggling everywhere. In Jamaica, in the US, in parts of Africa, they were struggling. He saw that and he said to himself, this cannot be a coincidence. Something has got to be done so that this can be fixed. And so when we think more about that, we should be able to really understand that this mutual understanding that these two entities have come up with, what real solidarity looks like, means that they're in a better position to stand by their word because they understand that it's bigger than them, which means they don't want to let the people down. That means they have real integrity, you all. That means they understand that everything they do, even if they get shot down tomorrow, their work will not be in vain because the people will rise again. What did Huey P. Newton say? You can't take the struggle out of the people because the struggle is always there. I know I'm not paraphrasing that right, and I'm sure Comrade Ajama will help correct me. But my point is, even if the FBI tried to kill 30 Africans today who were in organizations working for justice, it would not matter because the work that we're doing is advancing the people's struggle every single day. Right now, in this moment, it's advancing our struggle, whether you know it or not. I trust you to do your own research, but it's advancing the struggle. So that means if we're creating a solidarity framework, that means we're not going to go back on our word because it's bigger than us. We're not going to go back on our word because we can't let the people down. We're not going to go back on our word because that would make us a traitor to the people. And we have more than enough infiltrators who are slimy, sleazy people trying to front and pretend like they're down. And we have found ways to find them, remove them, and take them out of our struggle because they are no good to us. So we understand that with this work, you have to have integrity. With this work, you have to have a drive to understand this is bigger than you. The people are counting on me. And then the humility, right? The humility for you to understand, wow, I was chosen to do this work. And I'm so glad that I stepped into this space to do this because your purpose and your path could be something very different. But for you to be chosen to do this work to advance the struggle of people, to change the world for every single person, not just African people, but the work you're doing is impacting so many people. We just saw the slide of Palestinian people working with Burkina Faso people. So we know that there's different connections. So as I wrap this slide up, we need to understand, you all, that when we think about the timeline, okay, when we're thinking about how solidarity has really formed itself and come to be, we have got to understand, even if we see the picture and we think of our comrade Kwame Ture, who was with this organization, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, but he also was with the Democratic Party of Guinea, and he was a connecting member, excuse me, not a member, but he was a connecting affiliate because, again, this practice of solidarity with our comrade Russell Means and our also comrade Dennis Banks with the American Indian movement, right? So again, we're seeing these connections, the work that these folks have done and these organizations and how these two organizations have continued to show up for each other and have each other's back, literally where they're creating spaces in their programs for these other organizations to come and speak, right? So solidarity can be used as a weapon because that's one of the main ways that capitalism can be taken down. That's one of the main ways that we weaken capitalism, when we can literally unify our forces together, when we can connect ourselves with other entities. Like I said, it doesn't just have to be African organizations, because African organizations united is not going to fix the problem. We have dehumanization and colonization all over the world outside of it impacting Africa, which means we should be connecting with every single person who has ever been impacted by any type of oppression. And that way we can really use it as a weapon, because we can find a way for all oppressed people to understand that for us to address our oppression, that means that we have to unite together and figure out a way through those organizations that we are talking about. We can figure out a way to truly, truly weaken the system. We see that already taking place. This is not a foreign concept, you all. We see that happening with the folks of Haiti. Do you think that the French has been able to be as successful? No, because Haiti has been resisting. They have been fighting. They have been doing everything they can to terminate the French colonization regime. And it has made it very difficult for France to function and do all the things that it was trying to do. We think about the comrades in Guinea-Bissau. And I always think about how the Portuguese thought that they had everything under control. And then folks started fighting back. And we had armies that were led by Theodore Gomes and all these different folks who were pushing back and making it so difficult for the Portuguese to do what they can do. We even think about our Palestinian comrades and how they have been fighting for years. But just recently, now we're starting to figure out the criminalization of Hamas, but we have to ask ourselves, but Palestine didn't just become under attack last year in October. It's been that way for at least a decade, and if not longer, I would argue. So we can think about that. We can think about when Palestine was erased and taken off the map. And I also think we should think about how these folks have been pushing back. They've been fighting back. And because of that, these things may not be talked about, but that doesn't mean that they're not happening. This is why we have to increase our political education. So with that, we get to determine what our outcome is going to be in the future, but we have to decide what kind of choices we're going to make. And it starts with finding information that is ethical and credible and integral, and joining an organization that's working for justice.
Ashe, obrigada. And I think just to continue on, we want to get deeper into this question of solidarity, right? Myths, truths, and lies about international solidarity. And where we like to start with that, you all, is just by saying that, first off, we cannot and we will not, we refuse to let individuals, people that are not involved in our organized struggle for justice, define our position in relationship to these concepts. So people that are sitting behind computer screens or celebrities or people like that are not going to define how we look at solidarity. Because in our view, these people are not qualified to make that type of assessment. So you can look at people who are on YouTube or whatever, people like Umar Johnson, or whoever you want to look at, who has no organization, right? And who spends most of his time talking about celebrity type stuff and trying to frame that somehow into some kind of context about our people's struggle for liberation, to increase clout for himself, or I don't know, I don't know what his objective is there. But my point is that people like that are not going to define our question on solidarity. And I mention him by name because he has an extremely reactionary position on solidarity. He has this scarcity model position that as African people, we cannot afford to give any energies towards anybody else's struggle, because in his words, those people don't put any energy towards our struggle. And I know I'm mentioning this because I know a lot of you think like that and you believe that. But again, the reason why you think like that and believe that is because you're not involved in our struggle for justice, other than watching videos. You're not even reading about our struggle for justice. You're not even doing that bare minimum requirement. You're just looking at videos of people telling you what they want you to think, and you are not engaged in the struggle yourself, so you don't have the tools to be able to dissect what these people are telling you. And so what we're saying is that they don't get to define this. Instead, what will define the question of solidarity for us is an understanding of science. And in any battle that you engage in, what is the correct scientific strategy for you to achieve victory? And obviously, we all know the old saying, 2 heads are better than 1, 4 heads are better than 2. The more people we have fighting an enemy, nobody can disagree. That's obviously the most effective and the best strategy to achieve victory. So when we're talking about solidarity, that's where it starts, is that all we're saying is that there are other people who are not African who are fighting against the same enemies that we're fighting against. And so it just makes sense for us to, at least at a bare minimum, be aware and accepting of that, so that we don't allow our enemies to use us against each other, because that's one of their main strategies. And many of you are more than happy to allow them to use you that way. And so that's what we don't want to do. We don't want to deflect our energies from fighting our enemies to fighting each other, when we really don't have any reason to fight each other. Because I don't see any indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere that are exploiting a single African resource. I don't see any of them exploiting any masses of African people. No Palestinians are doing that. The diamond industry that's exploited by the state of Israel, the Palestinians are not the ones controlling the polishing of diamonds in the state of Israel that are stolen from Africa. They're not the ones doing that. That's a process the Zionists put in place to finance their exploitation and theft of the Palestinian land. So we understand that. So none of them are responsible for what's happening to us. There are nobody from the Philippines who are a part of the organized movement to shoot our people down in the streets in Europe, in the Americas, in Brazil, in the United States, in Canada. No people from the Philippine International Struggle for Justice are engaged in organizing that oppression against us. So that's what we mean when we say we have to look at who our enemies are and what's our best strategy to defeat them. And so that's what we mean when we say solidarity. And again, the only people that don't understand that or try to speak against that are people who are not doing that work to increase our capacity to win. And to be honest, we have to be totally transparent about what we're for. That's why we tell you point blank, we are revolutionary Pan-Africanists for revolutionary Pan-Africanism, which is a revolution to seize power in Africa, the international base for African people everywhere, run these capitalists and these imperialists out of there, and have a revolutionary change. That's what we're fighting for. We were very honest with you about that. We're not trying to sugarcoat it or make it sound more palatable to you. We don't give a damn if you can't handle it or not. You need to grow up if you can't handle it. Become an adult and look at what's happening in the adult world and study it and understand it critically and stop just reacting to stimuli. So we tell you the truth about that. But some of these people that some of us are listening to, they're not fighting for the same thing that we're fighting for. They're just fighting for their individual place within the international capitalist imperialist system, their piece of the pie, so to speak. So they can talk about all kinds of things because they're not in organizations, so they're not accountable to anything. And they can confuse so many of us because we're not in organizations and we're not accountable for anything, and we don't have any way to evaluate what they're saying to us. So that's why there's so much confusion. But that's what we're talking about when we say solidarity. We're talking about looking at the best strategy for us to win. And that clearly means uniting with people who are fighting the same enemies that we're fighting. So when we do that, what does that mean? Because a lot of people say, well, when we do that, if we do that, any focus we provide to these other struggles takes attention off of our struggle. And so for those of us who are actually doing this work, our response to that is we ask you where, show us where that's happening. Show us where in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we have had solidarity with the indigenous struggle for decades, solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for decades. Show us where that's taken any of our attention away from the struggle we're engaging in to unite Africa. You can't do it because it doesn't exist. Show us where that's happening. It's not happening. So that's not, to us, that's not a thing. That's something just in people's heads that they're putting out there to advance their individual position because it doesn't line up with their objective, which is, again, to create clout for themselves and resources for themselves. It doesn't help them do that. But in no way does it take any attention off of our struggle for African liberation. And that perspective that it does is a perspective devoid of any class analysis. And what we mean by class analysis is, and again, we can't, we've done plenty of workshops on class, so you should check them out if you don't know. And I know most people hearing that don't know because we don't study you all. So we're not going to take time to define all that for you today. But what we will say is that when we say it's devoid of class analysis, what we're meaning is that a lot of these things that people are saying are based on an analysis that's not grounded in history, and it's not grounded in representing the interests of the people's class. And by people's class, we mean people who are on the side of the masses of people in humanity. in the interests of the masses of people of humanity. A lot of these people are not, they don't care about the masses. They just want to advance themselves. So that's what we mean when we say devoid of class analysis. And when people say things like, well, Africans, we always give and we never receive support, that's just a completely ignorant and untrue statement. We have received tons of support. And again, we've done workshops on that. If you don't know what that is, you got homework to do. It's not our responsibility to validate your ignorance. If you don't know, you got work to do. We can certainly tell you if you want to come and find out more, you attend an orientation for the All African People's Revolutionary Party and you join and you seriously, and got to say that, seriously participate in one of our work study circle processes, you will learn these things I'm talking about, guaranteed. If you seriously participate, not half-assed participate, because that's what a lot of us do, just being totally honest about it. If you do that, you understand it. And this scarcity model should always be challenged as it relates to any question of solidarity. There are more than enough resources among oppressed people. This analysis that we don't have enough, and so we have to only focus on ourselves, is not, that's, just to give you an example of how silly that sounds. If you were taken hostage in a house by two people, and there are 10 of you taken hostage, you've all seen this type of thing is displayed in movies all the time. You've seen it. So you're in the house, and there's people that, you're saying we need to stick together and figure out how to get out of this situation. And there's always some people saying, no, I'm just going to do it on my own. And even in the dumbass movies, they don't ever make it, because that model goes against every law of nature. Obviously, in a situation like that, it would make perfect sense for you to unite, all 10 of you, and figure out a focused strategy to take down those two people. You should be able to do that since you outnumber them 4-1, right? So that's what we're talking about. It's not a scarcity model. It's just that some of us act like it is because, it doesn't fit the version of history that we need to advance our individual agenda. So how does international solidarity help us? Well, we have to understand first that we have to have an international consciousness. And that, again, is one of the problems. Most of us have no consciousness. We don't even have a national consciousness. We don't even know the history of our people here. Like this backward cesspool, we don't even know that. But we certainly don't have an international consciousness. Anytime like someone's talking like that dumbass rapper, Waka Flocka, like I mentioned, anybody talking like he was talking, that's somebody that doesn't know a damn thing about what's happening in the world. I mean, that's obvious to me in 5 seconds. Like this clown doesn't know anything about what's happening in the world. To sit here and say you don't know anybody in Africa, it's not about who you know. We don't give a damn who you know. History is objective. It's not subjective. It's not based on what you know or what you recognize. It exists whether you know or recognize it or not. That's just objective history. History happened before we all got here. It'll happen after we're gone. It's objective. It's not based on how we want to interpret it. That's a bourgeois idealistic approach to it. So we have to have an international consciousness. We have to study and understand what's going on in the world. And since the forces that oppress us do so on an international basis, if we don't have an international consciousness, that's the reason why we don't understand the conditions that we're in or how to address them. So again, if you participate in processes that are designed to give you that, like our work study process and processes that other organizations have, then you can develop that type of international consciousness and you can understand our conditions. And once you begin to do that, you will realize how ridiculous this scarcity model is and how much it prohibits our potential for growth and victory. And when we have that consciousness, we begin to recognize that our struggle does not exist in some vacuum, like these people are trying to convince you that it does. That whether we like it or not, our struggles are always going to be linked to other people who are struggling. And the reason why that's universally true is that international imperialism, and again, if you don't know what imperialism is, you got work to do. We've done plenty of workshops on that. There's information everywhere about what imperialism is. We're not going to waste time defining it for you. You got work to do. I mean, for me, when I hear something I don't understand it, I go to work to figure out what it is. That's just me. That's just how I want to walk through this life. I don't celebrate ignorance. And I don't want to be around people that do. So if you don't know something, you should be writing notes. Okay, imperialism, I don't know what that is. Solidarity, I don't know what that is. And then you got work to do. And if you're serious, you'll do that work. If you're not serious, you won't do it. You'll blame us. Well, they just talking about, I don't need it. And then we know you're not serious, so we don't have to waste time with you. But international imperialism oppresses all of us. And a great example, obviously, is Zionist Israel's exploitation of African resources. Zionist Israel's one of their main gross national products, as I mentioned, is they produce 40% of the polished diamonds on the international diamond market. And there's not a single diamond mine in occupied Palestine, what they call the state of Israel. Those are diamonds stolen from Africa. So that's a primary example. So if we want to liberate African people, and we're smart enough to realize that liberating Africa is central to that process, and we know that the Zionist state of Israel is one of the forces helping keep Africa and African people down because their entire economy is based on exploiting African resources, we would have to be the biggest damn fools in history if we didn't see the necessity of supporting the Palestinian struggle to defeat the state of Israel. That's just objective. It doesn't matter about, people come with this nonsense. Well, the Arab store on the corner treated me bad, so I don't want to support the Palestinians. I mean, what kind of childish mentality is that? As if the African store across the street treated us any better. Because I'm not one of these people that just talks about the ghetto. I come from one. I grew up in one. So there were African stores there were Arab stores, there were Asian stores, there were European stores. All of them mistreated us in the ghetto. Not one of them treated us well. Not one of us sold us quality goods. Not one of them treated us with dignity and respect. They all thought we were going to steal. And for the most part, we did because they mistreated us. So, that's just a backward ass analysis if that's all you got. And you can't see the big picture, the international consciousness picture, that regardless of whether every Arab store we walked in mistreated us, if the Palestinians defeat the state of Israel, that helps our struggle to liberate Africa. Objectively, it does that. Another example is white supremacy pitting indigenous and African people against one another. And many of us fall right in line with that backwardness. And we refuse and just don't have the capacity to see at the end of the day who benefits from that. Clearly, our communities have not. You can't show me one way that African people have benefited by battling with indigenous people. And the indigenous people can't show me one way that their people have benefited from battling against us. It's just not a reality. But that great philosopher, the comedian Chris Tucker, in the Rush Hour movie, said it perfectly. You want to know how to identify the struggle, follow the white man with the money. That's what he said in the movie, and that's 100% correct. So since we know that, all of you know when I say that's true. Nobody could say, well, that's not true for this reason. You out of your damn mind. Of course that's true. So if that's true, who does it benefit for Black and brown people to be focused on fighting each other? All that does is keep us preoccupied so that we don't focus on the real enemy. And we're not saying the real enemy is white people. White people are more disorganized than we are. The real enemy is the international capitalist imperialist network, which is predominated by white people, but there are plenty of Negroes that exist within it. You just got this bourgeois woman now is running to be the president of this empire. She's a part of the bourgeoisie in this country. She's a Negro woman, but she's still a part of the bourgeoisie in this country. And she's locked up plenty of Africans in her career as a prosecutor to validate her credentials as a member of the bourgeoisie. Class analysis. Again, I know I lost a lot of y'all. You don't understand that. But she's a Black woman. She's the AKA. We need to see you support her. Okay, you support her. You do that. That's you, because you want to identify with the bourgeoisie system. We're trying to tear it down because it does nothing to benefit the masses of our people. So we're just on different sides of the fence, if that's what you think, and that's fine. You know, we'll settle that at some point on the battlefield. But imperialism is intelligence apparatus. They work tirelessly to turn our musics inward and against one another. And most of the time, we have no knowledge and understanding of that, and no ability to critically look at it and figure out. They're so happy when they see us speaking that ignorance, that anti-solidarity ignorance. And again, just on the screen, there's just one example of the solidarity, right? In 1835, the St. Augustine uprising, where indigenous Seminoles, indigenous people, Africans, when they escaped the slave plantation, that was one of the few places we could go. Places like the Seminole Nation, and they accept us in. So a lot of these confused Negroes, well, we're Indians. Well, that's the reason why, clown, because when we escaped the slave indigenous areas and we formed solidarity with them, and of course we interacted with them, made it with them, of course that's going to happen. And so that's why you're part indigenous, idiot. It's not because you've always been here for thousands. Are just so set up in this backward position. And we've got, and here my internet is, you know, whenever we start talking about something that needs to be talking about, the internet gets unstable. That sure is interesting. Okay, so this is what happened though in 1835 against the European plantation owners in Florida. Is we united and we had several successful battles against the Europeans. We need to do more of that. We should have never participated as Buffalo Soldiers, clearing out the indigenous people. We should have united with the indigenous people and ran these Europeans back to Europe. That's what we should have done. And so, picture on the screen, Ernesto Che Guevara in the jungles of the Congo in 1965, engaging to support the forces of the National Congolese movement who were fighting to overthrow Mobutu, backed by the Central Intelligence Agency, their effort to sabotage the Congo. It's still sabotaged to this day because the Congo has so many resources that they need and want. At that time, it was uranium to build atomic weapons because you had the Cold War, the nuclear weapons. That's how. It's always been something with the Congo because they have so much. The cobalt is what's used to, you can't charge your phones or your computers without cobalt. So this is why they've constantly, the Congo's been a center of act. And in 65, like I mentioned, the Cubans sent forces there to fight after they assassinated Patrice Lumumba, who was trying to unite the Congo and contribute towards Pan-Africanism. In doing so, Mobutu was a puppet of the CIA, and Che Guevara went to the Congo. And I just finished reading a book that talked about how the white mercenaries came from what was then apartheid South Africa, led by the notorious white supremacist Mike Hoare. And they were hired by Mobutu, but a tool for imperialism. He hired them and paid these white mercenaries to fight the Lumumba's forces in the Congo from racist South Africa. And this book talked about how mercenaries faced in the Congo were the people trained by Che Guevara. So this is why we love Che Guevara, because he exhibited the most magnificent example of solidarity by going clear across the world to Africa, putting his life on the line, fighting. He got nothing out of it. He didn't get any international prestige because most of you never heard of him doing this before we told you about it. So he didn't get any prestige from it. So you use that because your enemies will tell you, well, he was racist against Africa. How the hell can he be racist against African people when he went to Africa and fought for our people? Most of you goddamn people won't even lift a fingernail a toenail, a hangnail for our people. So we're sick of have our interests at heart and arguing with us. Stop arguing. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. Do your necessary work and then come talk to us, and we'll talk to you a lot nicer. But we're sick of going through that. Get qualified, and then we'll talk. We love to talk. But until then, you're wasting our time. So the takeaways are, it's very hard to find anyone active in organizing work who is against international solidarity. It's always when you find someone saying, yeah, we can't unite with those people, the next question out of your mouth should be, what organization are you in? Of course, if you're not in an organization, you can't really ask that question, can you? But if you are in an organization, that should be the next question out of your mouth. It is out of mine, because I already know they're not in an organization. It's a hypothetical question. It's a theoretical question. It's not an actual question. I know they're not in an organization. But I ask them that to make the point that, how do you know what solidarity is? You've never done any work to achieve it or not achieve it. You don't even know. And these folks, like it says, are individualistic, capitalists usually, anti-solidarity, no organization. We don't need to waste time with that. It's a waste of our time. So that's what I do. What organization are you in? I don't even know organization. Okay, goodbye. I'm not wasting my time with you. I got better things to do. I'm trying to organize. I'm trying to work with people. And all you're trying to do is just take up space. So you go take up space somewhere else. And at the very least, it's imperative that we develop and maintain respect for our movements so that we make it impossible for our enemies to continue to use us against one another. So in other words, what that means is, at the very least, you all, we have to get educated on a collective level about what struggles are taking place in the world, so that at the very least, we can be in a position to know that it does not benefit us to be used against other people struggling against the same enemies we're struggling against. It doesn't benefit us to be against the Cuban Revolution, which is struggling against the same capitalist imperialist network that oppresses us. It doesn't help us to be against the indigenous people, against the Palestinian people, against the Filipino resistance movement, against the Irish Republican movement. It doesn't benefit us to be against any of those movements, and it doesn't benefit any of them to be against any of our movements, and they're not against any of our movements. And the reason why I know that is because I'm doing the work. I interact with those communities all the time, you all, because we're all doing the work. So we're naturally, as Shakur said, going to find ourselves intersecting with the work. And so I know what they do for our movement, and I know what we do for their movement. And the only reason why people don't know is because they're not involved in the work. So we're not listening to you if you're not involved in the work. You're wasting our times. Normalize not listening to people who aren't doing the work. That's what we need to do today. And if that's you, then that's you. You can correct that problem, but we are not going to run away from it. That's what we need to do. Normalize not listening to people who are not doing the work. Do the work, and the more of us who adopt that credo, the faster we'll get where we need to go. We thank you for joining us today. We want to invite you back next week, Sunday, July 28th. We have several programs there. Pan-African Women's Day. We want to talk about why Pan-African Women's Day is so critical. You know, our enemies have their institutions. We have to have our institutions. So Pan-African Women's Day is one of the critical institutions that we have. So join us next week when we talk about that. But before you do that, you should go to www.aprp-intl.org, and you can get information on how to log in to our International Pan-African Women's Day webcast. We also have a number of events on the ground here in throughout the world, throughout Africa, Europe, throughout the cesspool, backward empire, United Snakes of America. We have all of these wonderful Pan-African Women's Day events, and you can find out information about the on-the-ground events at the website as well. Go to the QR code in the upper left-hand corner, the red one, and you can get information about other AAPRP programs. Maybe you don't like this one, that's fine. You can find another one you like, or you can like multiple ones and participate in them. We encourage you to do that. And we also can get information about our Forward Ever shop there, where you can buy clothes, hoodies, t-shirts that have slogans supporting the African Revolution, Pan-Africanism, the United States of Africa. Please do that. By doing that, you support the work of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which you should do. And also, if you want to just directly support the AAPRP, you can go to Venmo at A-APRP or PayPal at AAPRP no dash. And we appreciate that. And we have one of our many projects on the ground in the lower right-hand corner QR code. Scan that. The Burkina Books, the Thomas Sankara Center for Liberation and Pan-African Unity in Burkina Faso. We have many projects like this on the ground in Africa, so support that. Buy my book, A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence. We use proceeds to support our anti-fascist work. If you don't know what that means, you got another word to add to your list, but to stop white supremacists from terrorizing you. Just understand that. Thank you for joining us today. Forward ever, backwards never. Enjoy the rest of your day.